Hello again, Kim Lane, API Evangelist here for one of my API Evangelist conversations where we just talk to interesting folks who are doing interesting things with APIs. Let's not waste any time. Let's find out who we have today. Hello, who are you?
Hi, Ken. I'm Vincent. Nice to meet you virtually.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you as well. What do you do? What's your day gig, Vincent?
Yeah, I'm a principal software developer on the Microsoft Graph Developer Experience team. So, Microsoft Graph is one of the main APIs at Microsoft to do things about calendars, files, emails, and so many other things. And my team is responsible for building the client experience tools, SDKs, and more. And more recently, we've also taken a responsibility for Copilot extensibility. So having the ability to have Microsoft 365 Copilot call into external APIs and data sources, reason over that, and bring an answer to the user based off that.
Yeah, interesting space. So let's get to, I would say SDKs and Kiota and AI as another kind of. I think both of these for me are integrations, but
Right.
right at the Open API kind of that bridge to those worlds. I know there's a lot of other technical details about completeness of Open API quality, and when you're dealing with such an expansive API like the Graph API, I know
Mhm.
there's probably a lot of devil in those details. So can you
Yes.
talk to us about what your team focuses on at that kind of parsing,
Yes.
that layer?
So let's start by acknowledging the fact that Microsoft Graph has over 23,000 operations, get post batch, put, and so on and so forth. Over 2,000 models, over 5,000 endpoints or path items, um, and so many other things. So it would not be feasible for us to ship SDKs for the whole API surface across, .NET, Java, Go, TypeScript, and so many other languages if we had to handcraft all the SDKs. Or we would need thousands of people monkey typing away, and that would not be interesting work anyway, right? So to be able to scale through that, we are relying heavily on code generation for the SDKs. So my team has built over the last 4 years an open source code generator for OpenAPI, and its name is Kiota, Kiota. And what it does is it takes as an input an OpenAPI description, processes it, and gives you all your models, a fluent API surface to craft a request, handle serialization, deserialization, retry handling, compression, redirect, all those nitty gritty details. So you can focus on where you add value as a developer, which is building the application, not actually integrating HTTP calls, right? And so this same generator we use to generate the SDKs that we put on the feeds like NuGet, NPM, and so on and so forth. But you can also use to create your own SDKs, either as an API consumer or as an API provider. It's really up to you. In fact, we even have GitHub who is using Kiota to generate their SDKs for their REST API as well. My team is also, because we have so much tooling and a deep presence with OpenAPI, my team is also responsible for the OpenAPI.NET library, which is the .NET library that parses OpenAPI descriptions and serializes OpenAPI descriptions, and you can do a number of things. That's the same library that you're using if you're doing ASP.NET Core APIs and you generate OpenAPI descriptions. All of that relies on the same library. And we're also working very, very hard lately to bring OpenAPI 3.1 support, and we're late to the party in this library. So all of our tooling and ecosystem can now benefit from uh, the improvements of a new OpenAPI specification version.
So you said a lot in there, but there was some nuance in what you said that I don't
Sure.
hear with normal SDK folks.
Mhm.
Is SDKs and generating SDKs is quite often a producer thing, meaning, hey,
Mhm.
I'm producing an API. I've got to provide SDKs in multiple
Right.
languages for my consumers. I'm going to generate and then say, here you go.
Yep.
But what you articulate is that, but then you also said as a consumer, I can come take your open API and I can choose what paths and I have some agency and control in what I can generate.
Exactly. Because if you project on yourself more and more, the applications don't talk just to one API, they talk to multiple APIs on the market, right? And then you have one API provider who provides an SDK built a specific way, another API provider providing an SDK built another completely different way. So you have to relearn everything. The third API provider doesn't have any SDK for your language at all. So the experience is not consistent at all as a consumer. And then as an API provider, having to build all those SDKs across so many languages, which you might or not have the funding for, the expertise for, and so on and so forth, is all very costly, time consuming. And this is not where you're adding the most value to put it bluntly, right? And so with Kiota, one of the bets we've been making is maybe we should turn things around a little bit and say, hey, providers, provide the best, cleanest OpenAPI description as you can. And there are tools here to help you, like Spectral and others, and so on and so forth. And then consumers, well, don't bother with SDKs anymore. Use Kiota or another generation tool. Generate the SDK that you need for just the parts of API that you need, because that's another thing, right? In Graph, we have 23,000 operations. Our .NET SDK is something like 20 megs. Maybe you don't need the whole thing, right? Maybe you just want 3 operations in there, generate just for that. And now you get going and you have a consistent experience across multiple API provider, and everybody's happy across the board, right? So that's another bet we've been making, and we're happy to see more and more people are adopting this strategy as we consume APIs.
Yeah, that's powerful. And that's not a narrative I hear from many SDK generations or just people approaching SDKs. I wouldn't even say SDK generation, just like as a producer, why do we produce SDKs?
Mhm.
But for me, these are I try to generalize them as integration issues. You know, you need to provide SDKs and code in different languages for different platforms, for different needs, for different frameworks. And it really takes knowing your consumers.
Right.
And so I try to stick in that realm. I stay in specs, I stay in Git, I want to understand the parsers and SDKs as you put it forth. But one thing that's kind of I've approached every application as it's come, you know, web, mobile, IoT, all of these with a similar attitude. And I'm struggling keeping the same attitude with AI when it comes to this is just another application because there are nuances and there are concerns and needs and different things. But can you speak to what the integration layer looks like when we're talking about AI applications and chatbots and agents?
Uh, yeah. So for probably over a year, 18 months now, Paradigm has emerged where one of the ways to make so okay, let's start with the basics. LLMs are trained on a fixed data set at a fixed point in time. If you ask just the LLM a question that's about information that appeared after that point in time, the LLM won't know about that. And if you need to have access or to reason over data that's stored in some kind of application or some kind of database, it won't be able to do it on its own. So one of the strategies to overcome that is called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation, I think. And the idea is to say, hey, we'll ask a question to the LLM. The LLM will know that it has a couple of extensibility points that it can call out to. They are called functions in the object model of the LLMs usually. So it knows that, oh, I can go get, I don't know, emails here. I can go get calendar events there. I can go do other things here and there, right? And of course, most of the times, these capabilities, those functions are actually API calls. Like it's the ability to say, I'm going to call an API with a bunch of parameters, and that's going to retrieve the data set I'm looking for. And then once I have all the data, I can reason over that and give a more precise or more accurate answer to the user. And better yet, because APIs are not just about reading, now you also unlock the potential for the LLM to do actions to after having reasoned about a few things, actually change things in the system or the application. A good example of that is, please LLM go read all my emails because I cannot keep up with my inbox. And if anybody is asking for to meet me, go ahead and schedule 30 minutes with them and reply to them automatically with a nice message and something like that, right? So when you do that, you have the initial question that goes to the LLM. The LLM will understand that there is an ability to read emails. We'll go call the APIs to do those things. It's actually the orchestrator, but I don't want to get too deep in there. And then once it has all the recent emails, we'll be able to read the content and reason over that, identify that one of them is about asking for you and I to meet, for example, and then we'll reason again, go talk to the API that creates events or meetings and whatnot, schedule that, and everything is done at the end of the day, right? And all of that transits through API calls. And so part of what my team has been working on is this idea of plugins. So you can say to the LLM, hey, here are a bunch of things that you can go call and use for your reasoning and to answer the user.
What would you say the relationship between those plugins are and, the kinda atomicity of those requests? You mentioned calendar, little things, and what you mentioned with SDK generation and, like, open API management, like, a lot of people generate an open API or a SDK from an entire open API. Do you feel like that flexibility you're allowing at the SDK and kinda open API management level is gonna play or be beneficial at the RAG layer in this kind
Of
of.
course, one of the biggest limitations of uh, LLMs is they have a finite number of tokens, words, or context you can pass to the LLM so it can reason about. And so, for example, in the case of Microsoft Graph, it would be impossible to feed it 75 megs of text, which is the description of the API, and hope for the best for it to be able to do anything with that, right? And so that's one thing where our tooling shines. You have again because we built so much intelligence into being able to select down to the operation you care about and just generating for that in the SDK world. Well, we took that same capability and brought it to the plugin generation story. So now you can generate a plugin with the attached OpenAPI description, which is effectively a subset of the original one about with only what you care about. The other important thing with LLMs is they get confused if they get too many choices, and especially if the choices don't come with enough context or don't come with enough instructions. A good example of that is let's assume you have two operations, one which is about creating messages, creating emails, and another one which is about sending messages, which would create it implicitly, right? So if you have both operations in context and not enough instructions, the LLM is going to struggle to figure out which one it needs to call to be able, even if you say send an email explicitly, right? And so again, this ability to select and trim down to exactly what you care about will give you faster answers from the LLM, more reliable answers from the LLM, and those are the kind of tooling we're kind of building, which is currently in public previews, internal previews, and so on and so forth. But yeah, the accuracy of the description is paramount for the LLM to be able to do what you want it to do. Otherwise, it's going to hallucinate and be unreliable and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I'm getting more and more work to create open APIs for existing public APIs because I have a pretty extensive library. But I whittle them down to just one or two operations, paths and operations, and then I wrap them with JSON LD or schema.org, some other semantic that
Mhm.
helps them understand a little bit more, going beyond the tagging that's available in an open API and giving it more of that context in those
Mm.
install.
That's also a space we're exploring on our end. You've probably heard about that design language called TypeSpec, which is you can imagine TypeSpec being the TypeScript equivalent to OpenAPI, or
Mhm.
what TypeScript is to JavaScript. It's effectively a higher order design language that
Mhm.
eventually transpiles down to an OpenAPI description that you can feed to other tooling and so on and so forth. And so as we noticed that sometimes some operations like clarity, instructions, or other things like that, we've been working on extending type specs so it can generate more information in the OpenAPI description to feed later on into the model. So there is more context here. I don't think there's anything out to try yet, but the work is being done publicly in open source repositories, so it's easier to track
Yeah.
and play with.
Yeah, type specs it's been interesting to watch where things are going for a while now. Out of all of this, everything we just talked about, what keeps you coming into work?
Oh, well, I like to work at scale on interesting problems that solve uh, issues for the day-to-day life, not only for corporations, it's great, they make money and so on and so forth, but also for individuals. Um, I truly believe that the more APIs we enable and integration of those APIs into applications, the simpler our lives all will become. Like lately, I've been, dealing with banks and notaries on one side, and also with healthcare system on the other side, and all of that is still to this day. You need to call somebody and wait for hours on with a ringing tone and whatever for somebody to pick up and understand what you want to talk about, right? And when you transpose that and say, hey, well, maybe if you had a bunch of APIs that were publicly documented and somebody had a good idea on your device to integrate those APIs in an LLM and so on and so forth, or as an application that talks to between different providers, that would be much easier. And that would be, chatting with an agent or filling a form somewhere. And I would not have to spend so much time on the phone and so on and so forth. And I think that's going to make everybody's lives uh, with a bit less friction, right? You don't want to spend your time on the phone or anything like that, right? So I can see that APIs and the whole ecosystem around it, and then when you add on top of that all the LLM stuff, will drastically reduce friction for everybody's life on a day-to-day function. And I'm working to enable that. So that's what gets me going, I guess.
I support that. Definitely, I would say it's human centered, which reflects my view of things, and so it's refreshing to hear talk about AI with a focus on the people. I think
Mhm.
that's an important aspect. But I appreciate you coming by, Vincent, and sharing the story and talking with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks. Yeah, and definitely the human centeredness. I love it. I also love the agency at the open API, the kind of parser, the generator level. That is super key. And I think that's a piece that a lot of people miss. And that's the developer, the end user, the kind of agency that's going to be needed in there actually power agents. And I think that side of the coin doesn't get a lot of discussion. So really appreciate him sharing that. All right. That's another one, another good one. Thank you. Talk to y'all later.